October 24th, 1929, Black Thursday, the day the stock market crashed, plunging America into the Great Depression. Millions lost everything. Banks collapsed. Unemployment hit a staggering 25%. Bread lines stretched for blocks. The American dream became a decade-long nightmare. The official story is simple. A classic case of reckless speculation and unregulated capitalism. A bubble that was bound to burst. A tragic but inevitable market accident. But what if that story is a lie? What if the Great Depression wasn't an accident at all? What if it was an engineered collapse designed to consolidate power and reshape the American financial system for the benefit of a select few? The evidence points to something far more sinister than a simple market correction. Think about it. Wealthy insiders sold off their stocks weeks before the crash. Major banks started calling in loans, choking off the money supply just when the economy needed it most. And in the chaos that followed, a small group of institutions scooped up priceless assets for pennies on the dollar, while ordinary Americans lost it all. But the real story, the one nobody talks about, isn't just about the stock market. It was about fundamentally changing who controls America's money. And the scariest part? The techniques used to engineer that crisis are being deployed again today, on a scale that makes the 1930s look like a dress rehearsal. To understand how this could have been planned, we need to look at the years before 1929. The crash didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the result of deliberate actions. The Federal Reserve, created back in 1913, spent the 1920s experimenting with the money supply in unprecedented ways. From 1924 to 1927, the Fed flooded the system with cheap credit, deliberately fueling a stock market frenzy. This easy money worked exactly as intended. Stock prices soared, everyday Americans, told that prosperity would last forever, borrowed money to buy stocks on margin. You could put down just $10 to buy $100 worth of stock. As long as prices went up, the profits were huge. But if they fell, the losses were catastrophic. By 1928, the entire market was a giant house of cards built on debt. And here rests the crucial point. The people who created this bubble knew it couldn't last. Federal Reserve officials, top bankers, and elite investors understood they were creating a ticking time bomb. Yet they kept the party going until the last possible moment. Throughout 1928 and early 1929, the warning signs were impossible to miss. But they weren't just signs for the public. They were signals that insiders were getting out. In early 1929, powerful financiers quietly sold off their massive stock holdings. Paul Warburg, one of the Fed's founders, issued public warnings about the orgy of speculation. The economist Roger Babson flat out predicted a crash that would wipe 60 to 80 points off the Dow. And what about Joseph Kennedy, father of JFK? He famously cashed out his entire fortune in early 1929 after getting a stock tip from a shoeshine boy. His logic was simple. If even the shoeshine boy is playing the market, it's time to get out. These weren't lucky guesses. These were the calculated moves of people who knew the bubble they helped inflate was about to burst. The most damning evidence lies in what the Federal Reserve did next. Just as it had created the bubble with easy money, it deliberately popped it by slamming on the brakes. Starting in early 1928, the Fed began aggressively raising interest rates from 3.5% to 6% in less than a year. It choked off the credit that was the market's lifeblood. Then just months before the crash, the Fed started pressuring banks to cut back on margin loans, the very practice they had previously encouraged. It was like pulling the foundation out from under a skyscraper and then pretending to be surprised when it collapsed. The timing was too perfect to be an accident. The same institution that built the bubble then lit the fuse. The crash itself unfolded with suspicious precision. On October 24th, massive coordinated sell orders flooded the stock exchange the second the opening bell rang. The ticker tape fell hours behind, phone lines crashed. In the midst of this chaos, a group of major banks, led by JP Morgan, made a big show of stabilizing the market by buying stocks. The media praised them as heroes, but it was a performance. Their purchases were tiny, just enough for good PR, while behind the scenes they were dumping their own holdings. The real goal of this engineered crash becomes clear when you see who won. While America suffered, a small financial elite consolidated unimaginable power. Over 9,000 banks failed between 1930 and 1933. But it wasn't random. Small, independent banks were left to die, while the big banks with Fed connections got support. These survivors then bought up the assets of the failed banks, businesses, real estate, entire industries, for practically nothing. By the end of the Depression, economic power was in fewer hands than ever before. The crisis was also the perfect excuse to rewrite the rules. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 was sold as a reform, but it actually helped the biggest banks by eliminating their competition. And then came the final move. In 1933, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 6102, forcing all Americans to surrender their private gold to the government in exchange for paper dollars. The official reason was economic emergency, but the real reason was control. As long as people could own gold, they had an escape from the paper money system. By confiscating gold, the government forced everyone into a system managed entirely by the Federal Reserve. Immediately after, the government devalued the dollar by nearly 70%, instantly stealing wealth from everyone who had complied. This wasn't a rescue, it was the final step in a monetary takeover that began in 1913. And this wasn't just an American story. The same patterns of bubble, bust, and power consolidation were happening across Europe. Central banks coordinated to abandon the gold standard, giving them the freedom to manipulate their currencies. It was a global reset, orchestrated from the top down. The government's response, the New Deal, cemented these changes. Programs sold as temporary relief became permanent fixtures. Deficit spending, once considered a last resort, became standard policy. The crisis was used to justify a massive expansion of government and central bank control over every aspect of the economy, exactly what the architects of the system had always wanted. The techniques used to engineer the Great Depression have only been refined. Look at the 2008 financial crisis. The same script. The Fed created a housing bubble with easy money, then popped it with higher interest rates. The resulting crisis was used to justify massive bailouts and expanded government power. More recently, the response to the global pandemic saw the most aggressive use of these tactics yet, creating an economic crisis to justify unprecedented monetary expansion and control. So, was the Great Depression an accident? The evidence says no. It was a deliberately created crisis used to consolidate wealth and power. It wasn't the last engineered crisis, it was the prototype. The choice we have today is whether to remain ignorant victims or to recognize the pattern being built around us. Because the engineers of crisis depend on us not understanding the methods, and understanding those methods is the first step toward breaking free. Thanks for watching, and if this opened your eyes, make sure to subscribe for more hidden history.